Wendy Cukier is the president of the Coalition for Gun Control. Wendy, thank you so much for coming on the program tonight.
Thank you for having me.
What is your response? A new poll out today and taking a look and looking at support for the statement, I think that there should be a strict ban on guns in urban areas. And this was the Ecos Research Associates poll, finding 69% said yes to that statement.
It's not surprising. Polls have repeatedly shown the vast majority of Canadians support stronger gun laws. In fact, about 70% of Canadians in various polls have said they'd support a complete ban on handguns. 80% would ban assault weapons, 81% would support a database to track gun sales, 90% would support stricter background checks. So the vast majority of Canadians want stronger gun laws. Unfortunately, politicians aren't listening.
You know, that's an interesting thing. 90% of Canadians would want stronger background checks. Well, I'd like to know where that number comes from. I wouldn't expect Wendy to cite every number that she throws out there. I don't cite everything I throw out there either, but I do make a conscious effort to make sure what I'm saying is true. But even if they had a poll that they conducted themselves on the CBC website, I could see 90% of people wanting better background checks as just a passing thought. I would definitely want all of those 90% of Canadians, which I guess is 31 million people, to dictate to me what the current system is. And I'm about 99% sure they couldn't do it. So 90% of uninformed Canadians would agree with whatever I'm saying right now, right? So anyway, not a very good point.
When you say, though, one of those that you just pointed out, you said assault weapons. Isn't any weapon an assault weapon if you use it to hurt someone?
Assault weapons have a very specific definition in terms of their capacity for large magazines, semi-automatics that can be converted to fully automatic fire, and so on. So they have very distinct characteristics. I mean, the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Administration has a list of characteristics that define as an assault weapon, and Canada historically applied the same standard, but stopped updating the list in 1995.
But any weapon, if you were to convert it to an automatic weapon, would become an illegal weapon in Canada.
Well, it's not that easy to convert lots of guns to fully automatic. These are technical definitions. I'm not making it up.
And that's literally how long it takes. So Wendy's a few sentences in and boom, you realize immediately she has no idea what she's talking about. She has no idea how guns work. She has just zero knowledge about this stuff. She quotes, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is what that organization is actually called. It's not even a Canadian organization. It's an American one. And she's going to go on to say there's plenty of semi-automatic assault weapons out there. So, it's such a joke. The other interesting part, and the part to really note, is the minute that she starts getting pressed by Jill, who I will tell you knows more than Wendy about firearms. The minute she starts getting pressed, she's like, well, I'm not making this up. So right away, straight to the implying that she's being attacked, implying that she's having her knowledge doubted or whatever, right to I'm already offended. You're offending me if you don't agree immediately.
Right. I'm just saying already the laws that exist right now, that if you were a Canadian, if you were to, even if you had a license for a registered gun and you made it into a fully automatic weapon, you would be breaking the laws that are currently in place.
But semi-automatics, like a semi-automatic assault weapon can fire 20 rounds in 20 seconds. A fully automatic takes 9 seconds. It's a difference of 10 seconds. There are lots of semi-automatic assault weapons that are prohibited in most countries that we're selling in Canada.
So real quick, Jill is pressing her on a very important point. And again, Jill knows what she's talking about. She's saying that if I take a semi-automatic firearm that is legal to own and I convert it, I take the time and trouble to convert it to fully auto, it's prohibited anyway because it automatically becomes a prohibited firearm. So this was the issue with the CZ858, right, where the Canadian Firearms Center or the Firearms Lab was saying, oh, this is a firearm that's easily converted. And the problem is the guidelines actually say that, easily converted to full auto. Well, easy for who? A machinist who has a CNC machine and detailed CAD drawings of the parts required, or easy for me with a file and a ball peen hammer at home, right? So leaves a lot to interpretation. But again, the point is completely lost on Wendy.
The sniper rifle that was used to do the famous kill shot, that's sold as an unrestricted firearm in Canada. It fires 50 caliber. It's a 50 caliber weapon, and it's sold as an unrestricted weapon, which means there's no record kept of the sale. So there are huge gaps in our laws.
Now it's on to 50 cals. Can you imagine if people had 50 cals and they were non-restricted? And you'd think that an expert, as Wendy is, would know that it's non-restricted, not unrestricted. It's funny. Why doesn't anybody out there name for me one murder, one shooting in Canadian history involving a 50 caliber rifle? Well, guess what? I've never been able to find one, so I don't think one ever existed. But apparently, Wendy's answer is for people to have their doors kicked in and their property taken for absolutely and completely no justification. We're just going to do it to you, and we're going to make the government do it, because Wendy won't be kicking in any doors, I assure you. She'll have other people do it. You know what? I wonder if those other people will be armed with firearms. Anyway, just a passing thought.
With this idea that was put out in this poll about banning guns in urban areas, how would that make people safer?
Jack Layton proposed what he called gun-free zones when he was a city councillor in Toronto in the early 90s. There are some states in the U.S. where municipal governments have undertaken similar measures. Our position is that we want strong national laws, and we've outlined a number of priorities which, from our perspective, are more important in terms of keeping Canadians safe.
So, no answer.
Right, but if you were to ban them in urban areas, how would that translate to making people safer?
I don't know, because it's not a position that we support.
When we talk about gun control in Canada, it is a rigorous step or rigorous program that somebody goes through as far as they take a course, you write a test, you get a license, whether it's unrestricted is easier to get than restricted, and you hold that license. You go through not background checks every day, but you're run through CPIC every day. Do we not have pretty strict laws already in place?
There are lots of loopholes. So, for example, a police officer was killed in BC recently by a man whose license had lapsed, but he still had guns. And when asked why he would still have a license, the authorities said they simply don't have the resources to enforce the law. There's a judge in Alberta who said there are huge loopholes in the screening process. The number of prohibited and restricted weapons, primarily handguns and assault weapons, has doubled in the last 10 years. There are now 1 million, and that's largely because the legislation is no longer being strictly applied.
Okay, so let me see if I understand this correctly. The reason why the shooting sports are exploding and people are buying restricted firearms is because the law's not being strictly applied. Wow. Okay. I'm even having a hard time coming up with a rebuttal for that. Yeah, anyway, let's keep listening.
And in the incident in Abbotsford that you're talking about, where it was a horrible, sad incident where a police officer lost his life. In that case, though, so that man was breaking the law. He'd had a license. The license had lapsed, and he still had his weapon. Banning weapons wouldn't likely have changed that.
Again, I'm not sure why you're talking about banning weapons. Our position is we want strict controls over licensing. We want the licenses enforced. We want strict controls over the sales of firearms, and there are certain guns that don't belong in the hands of civilians. So what we're looking for is basically a rigorous, comprehensive system of gun control. And if we enforced licensing, which would mean that when someone's license expired, we make sure that they no longer have firearms, that would actually make a difference. If we ensured that when somebody has been threatening women, their license is revoked and their guns are confiscated, that would make a difference. So the enforcement of the law is a critical piece of this. It's not just the legislation that's on paper.
So this just keeps getting more nonsensical all the time and more schizophrenic. In one breath, Wendy says that she doesn't want to ban guns. And in the next breath, she says that there are certain guns that just don't belong in the hands of civilians. So maybe I'm not sharp enough to understand the difference. And the other thing she brings up is the murder of the police officer in Abbotsford. I've personally trained extensively with a lot of those guys. I assure you, I probably care about those guys and their safety on the job a lot more than Wendy does. Well, I guess I can't really cite that or prove it, but I'm just assuming, certainly by her tone. And I assure you, if somebody is off their rocker and they have the capacity to kill a police officer just so they don't get caught for car theft, I assure you that at some point in their lives, they had an opportunity to legally acquire firearms, and then they go off their rocker and become a cold-blooded psychopathic murderer. I'm sure they're not going to turn their guns in, or I'm sure they're not going to be adverse to acquiring guns illegally because it's against the rules. Like this is what we got to deal with all the time, and this is what's just this is where we're at an impasse, because you have, you know, common sense people talking about physical reality, and then you have these completely ideological, unreasonable people that want to throw out all kinds of crazy rules and take people's property and make very negative impacts in millions of people's lives for their own illusion of security. It's just disgusting.
I completely agree. We are expecting to hear from the current federal government about following through with changes to the regulations, changes to gun laws in Canada. Is that the main thing you would like to see, or are there other things you would like to see the federal government do?
Well, the federal government promised to reverse the most egregious measures that the Conservatives introduced, for example, reinstituting some of the stricter controls on handguns and restricted weapons, reintroducing controls and tracking of sales, which we had since 1977 and the Conservatives got rid of, making sure that the list of military weapons is updated, and so on.
Okay, so there's a lot that's important here. So Wendy describes these changes as egregious, like just egregious. I mean, that's some pretty strong language. So anyway, what are these terribly egregious changes? Well, when it comes to diminishing controls on handguns, she's actually talking about diminishing controls on all restricted and prohibited firearms, and it's associated with ATTs. So some of you may have seen that video that I did a while back on the Civil Advantage channel on YouTube called C42, Bill C42 for Dummies, I think it was called, and it had to do with ATTs. So if you want very detailed information on that, you can check that video out. I even show my ATT and how nothing has really changed. I think the only additional place I'm allowed to take my restricted firearm is to a gun show. Everything else was exactly the same as what I had. So there was no changes according to the conditions of ATTs. There were only two real changes in the law. One of them is basically you don't have to carry the paper copy of the ATT anymore. It resides, pardon me, it lives in a database. So should the police pull you over and they want to know whether you have an active ATT, they can check online like they do with your driver's license or whatever. Now, in the implementation period, or the implementation phase of this, the Canadian Firearms Program actually screwed the government and said, "Forget, we don't care. We're gonna win against you anyway. We don't care what the spirit of your law was." So instead, what you have to do is when your PAL comes in the mail, you know how it's stuck to that piece of paper like a credit card is. If you look down at the bottom third of that paper, it says on that paper the conditions of your authorization to transport, and it says that you have to have that paper prepared to present it to a peace officer upon request. So now instead of carrying 1.5 sheets of paper for public safety, obviously to stop the carnage, now you have to carry 1/3 of one piece of paper with you. And again, if you don't have that piece of paper, it's actually a criminal offense. So when it comes to, and people have argued with me about this, when it comes to restricted and prohibited firearms, if you don't have the registration certificate, if you don't have your ATT, and if you don't have your PAL on you, you're actually in contravention of the firearm regulation. And I'm just telling you, the two, it's a hybrid offense. The consequences of that are, upon a summary conviction, that's if you're a nice guy and they want to let you off, a $5,000 fine not up to, a $5,000 fine and or up to 6 months in prison. And if they proceed and are successful on an indictable charge, it's up to 2 years in prison on a first offense, 5 years for second and subsequent offense. And so you have these sledgehammer disproportionate penalties for paperwork offenses, and somehow Wendy thinks this stops people from getting hurt. Of course, it's completely ridiculous, and it's an argument that you'd expect from someone that had been drinking excessively. But whatever, I guess it's all part of the act for these people. The other change is the fact that you automatically get an ATT. You don't have to apply for it. Now, that's been fiddled around with the firearms program too. So it depends on the province you're at. They're still making you prove that you're a member of a gun club for them to do that, and that wasn't part of the regulation change, right? So anyway, the bureaucracy, as usual, is at war with the elected government. So those are the two changes that have this tremendous impact on public safety. Now she talks about controls on sales, on recording sales, and that applies to non-restricted firearms. So before, when we had before the long gun registry, there was a ledger system. So when someone bought a gun from a gun store, the gun store was obligated to write down the person's PAL or FAC and the serial number of the gun, just information on that transaction. When the long gun registry came in and was implemented, you no longer had to do that. Now, when the long gun registry was ended, when it was repealed, there was no requirement to do the ledger system. And what happened was the Canadian Firearms, the CFO's office in individual provinces went to the retailers and they said, we're instituting the ledger system again, but they didn't have the authority to do it. And they would threaten gun stores. I know this from 3 different people that this is true. I don't know it from 100, but I know it from 3 different people that said, yeah, they threatened not to renew my business license to sell firearms if I didn't comply with whatever it is that they actually just wanted. Not what they had the authority to implement, but what they wanted. So the government came back. It was Vic Taves at the time, came back and said, well, I'm going to institute a regulation that says that it's illegal it's against regulation for anyone to collect any information on the transfer of a non-restricted firearm. Now, the reason for that is that they're trying to assert themselves to say, hey, we make the laws and you enforce the laws. But again, like I said, the bureaucracy is always at war for control of the Canadian public, and it's just a symptom of government. So anyway, that's what she wants the ledger system back. Well, they'd want a gun registry, but they wanted the ledger system back. Bear in mind that even if the ledger system is implemented the minute that someone does a private transfer of a non-restricted firearm, there is no tracking of that. And guns can change hands. Right now, they're just property. You just need to be authorized to possess it. And then she also talks about the list of weapons hasn't been updated. List of assault military weapons or assault weapons, whatever she says, whatever inflammatory language she was using. So she's referring to the banned by name list. So the regulation, as in the law, as far as how firearms are classified, it's all there and it's all been implemented completely. But there was a little opportunity, just like the AR-15, for people to just say, yeah, I just don't like this gun. I'll let all these other semi-autos that use the same magazine, same firing rate, same trigger groups, same ammunition, same capability, same lethality, but I just don't like certain guns and I just want them banned for no reason because I saw a magazine that had a picture of one. And that's the list that she's a big proponent of. So again, here we go again. We don't want to ban guns. But we want to ban certain guns. So anyway, onwards and upwards.
They promised to do that. 2 years have gone by without action. So, we're getting kind of anxious as they approach midway through their term. I mean, those are sort of the minimal measures that I think are required because we've gone backwards. A recent study in BC showed, as a recent study in the city of Toronto showed, we now have more guns recovered in crime that originated in Canada than are smuggled in from the United States. What that means is that our current laws are making it so easy to get guns in Canada. The smuggling business is actually declining. That should horrify Canadians.
When you talk about handguns, though, if somebody has a restricted license in Canada and purchases a handgun, does that gun not stay tied to them? You're then registered. It's not the same as an unregistered gun that you might purchase. That gun is tied to you, is it not?
Handguns are restricted weapons. However, there have been changes to the law which relaxed the restrictions on the movement of those guns. The rigor of the law has deteriorated. That's why we've seen the number of legally owned handguns double in the last 10 years. In fact, we now have more than 1 million restricted and prohibited weapons, twice as many as we had 10 years ago. That's really a problem waiting to explode in our view, because restricted and prohibited weapons are supposed to be hard to get, and clearly that's no longer the case.
But if we're talking about people who have taken the course and who have been licensed, how is that a problem waiting to explode if we're talking about responsible gun owners?
Because they have relaxed the controls over where you can have the guns. They have relaxed the controls over authorizations to transport, and they're no longer applying the law as rigorously as it was intended to be applied. Getting access to a restricted weapon was supposed to be relatively difficult. You were supposed to have to prove you were a member of a gun club in good standing. You were supposed to have to show that you had a legitimate gun collection, and so on. And that is no longer being rigorously applied because the resources are not there, and because, frankly, the political will has not been there to strictly apply the gun laws. And that's why we've seen an explosion in the number of restricted and prohibited weapons in Canada, and that's a problem.
But even if you have a restricted weapon and you are an owner of that, it's not as though you can drive around with it. If you got caught driving around with that weapon in your vehicle and you weren't going from your home to the gun range or back, you would be charged.
That's not true. That was one of the changes that the Conservatives made, which was that you could have an authorization to transport your firearm from your home to any location in the province that had a gun club, which means basically you could be anywhere and claim that you were en route to a target shooting range. Those laws were dramatically changed under the Conservatives. The chief firearms officers in many provinces were horrified. The police were horrified, and the Liberals have not reversed those changes.
Okay, so now there's actually just lies going on. So Wendy is either grossly incorrect, which I'll give her the benefit of the doubt. She doesn't really know much, it seems, but she could also be acting in a completely deceptive way, which it wouldn't be the first time. So when it comes to ATTs, you can go onto the Canadian Firearms Program website. You can look under the update that was sent out when the ATT conditions first changed, and basically it said the same thing it said all the way back, in the dawn of time of ATTs, except they had this printed on the paper. It said that if you're going to and from any of the approved locations, you have to use a route that is reasonably direct in the circumstances. So can I just be driving anywhere? Is it complete? What if I'm up on a Forest Service road with a handgun? What am I going to try to convince conservation that I'm on my way to the gun club? That's an urban gun club and I live in a subdivision? No, of course not. So again, totally false statement to try to demonstrate some egregious, reduction in gun control when one does not exist. So anyway, all of that stuff is completely false. But I guess the strategy is just keep telling people the same thing over and over again with a dismissive tone until they believe it. And hopefully you'll get your way. So there's only like another 30 seconds. So I'm going to kind of sign off for you guys right now. Thanks for listening. There was a lot of detail here, but I think it's really important for all of you guys. If you don't know what those details were, that way you're better prepared to debate this stuff. And should someone ever challenge you on any of these facts that has been studying the Canadian Coalition for Gun Control, or the Coalition for Gun Control, I guess, if they've been studying their website, you know how to counter this stuff. And it's really important that you do, and you're factual, and you can cite where your information comes from.
Well, we will wait and see what the Liberals do. We've been told some changes are going to be made. Wendy, thank you so much. Appreciate you taking some time to chat with us this evening.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So thanks everybody for listening. I would say this, even though this is kind of a tough thing for maybe somebody that's anti-gun to listen to because I'm jumping in and disproving everything. What I would challenge somebody to do is to take one of my interviews and do the opposite. I'd love to see an anti-gun person take my interview, come in, and then cite where I'm wrong. I would listen to that 6 or 8 times, just myself. So anyway, thanks for hanging in there. Hopefully this was valuable for you guys, and we'll see you soon.
Join the CCFR or donate right now at www.firearmrights.ca.